matriarch's words echoed in my mind. We don't speak of the twins, and now I know why. My grandmother's house always seemed to exist in its own secluded world. Tucked away at the end of a winding dirt road in rural Vermont, surrounded by towering ancient maple trees, the Victorian mansion loomed its 3 stories, commanding attention. The house, with its weathered siding and steep roof, felt both timeless and mysterious. I spent every summer there as a child, wandering through endless rooms, finding hidden corners, and playing in the vast gardens my grandmother tended with a devotion that seemed almost sacred. Yet there was one place I was never allowed to go, a locked room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway. Whenever I asked about it, my grandmother would clench her lips and shake her head, whispering, "We don't speak of that. Some doors are meant to stay closed." Of course, her secrecy only made me more determined to uncover the truth. During thunderstorms, I would press my ear to the thick oak door, convinced I could hear faint children's laughter from within. Once I even tried to peek through the keyhole, but it had been sealed shut. When I asked my mother about it, she grew tense. "We don't speak of the twins," she said sharply, changing the subject immediately. It was the first time I'd heard the word twins mentioned in our family, and those words haunted me for years. After college, I moved away to build my career, and visits to my grandmother's house became rare. Life surged forward, and the mysteries of childhood faded into the background. But when my grandmother passed away last month at 97, I found myself once again driving down that familiar dirt road, the dense forest canopy closing in above me. The funeral was small. Just immediate family, my mother, my Aunt Catherine, and a few distant relatives I barely recognized. My grandmother had been the pillar that held us together, and without her, we seemed adrift. After the service, we gathered at the house. It felt smaller, emptier without her. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I wandered through the rooms, tracing my fingers along the dusty surfaces of old furniture and yellowed photographs. My mother found me in the library, staring at a portrait of my grandmother as a young woman. She looked so different, her face smooth, her eyes bright with the promise of life. "She left the house to you," my mother said softly, handing me a thick envelope. Inside, I found a brass key, old and ornate, and a letter in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "My dearest Eliza, if you're reading this, then I have passed from this world. The house is yours now, along with its secrets. I have carried this burden for too long, and I cannot take it with me to my grave. The key enclosed will open the locked room on the 3rd floor. What you find there may disturb you, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. The twins were born in the summer of 1952. Your grandfather and I were overjoyed. Twins hadn't been born in our family for generations. But that joy soon turned to despair. There was something wrong with them from the start, something I cannot bring myself to describe even now. We did what we thought was best at the time. Perhaps we should have sought help, but fear and shame drove us to terrible decisions. I've kept their room exactly as it was. Some might call it morbid, but I could never erase them completely. They were still my children. Forgive me, Eliza, and be careful. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. With eternal love, Grandma." I read the letter 3 times, each time my hands trembling more. The key in my palm felt unnaturally cold, as if it had been hidden away for decades, which I realized it likely had. My mother watched me from the doorway, her face masked in concern. "What does it say?" she asked. I hesitated before folding the letter and slipping it into my pocket. "Nothing important," I lied. "Just some instructions about the house." That night, after everyone had gone, I found myself standing at the foot of the staircase to the 3rd floor. The key weighed heavily in my pocket. Part of me wanted to throw it away to respect my grandmother's secrecy. But curiosity, as always, won out. The third-floor hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through a small window at the end. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I walked past dust-covered paintings and old furniture draped in white sheets. When I reached the locked door, I hesitated. Was I ready to uncover a family secret that had been hidden for over 70 years? Before I could second-guess myself, I slid the key into the lock. It turned easily as though it had been used just yesterday. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a room bathed in silver moonlight. It was a nursery preserved as if frozen in time. 2 identical cribs stood side by side against the far wall, their once white paint now yellowed with age. A rocking chair sat in the corner, a knitted blanket draped over its arm. Toys, wooden blocks, cloth dolls, and tin soldiers were neatly arranged on shelves, awaiting hands that would never hold them. The air smelled stale, but not unpleasant, with traces of lavender and something else I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, half expecting to hear the laughter I had imagined as a child, but the room was silent. On a dresser between the cribs sat a silver-framed photograph. I picked it up, brushing away a layer of dust. In the faded photo, my grandmother, much younger, held 2 infants wrapped in identical blankets. She was smiling, but even through the image's age, I could see the strain around her eyes, the tension in her posture. I set the photograph down and moved to the cribs. They were empty save for 2 small, handmade quilts, each embroidered with the names Theodore and Theodora. I ran my fingers over the stitching, feeling a connection to these relatives I had never known, whose time had long passed. Then something caught my eye. A small, ornate wooden box hidden beneath the stack of photographs. It was intricately carved with delicate patterns, as if it had been crafted with great care. I lifted it out carefully, feeling a strange weight in my hands, as though it contained something far more significant than its size suggested. The box was sealed with a small metal clasp, and as I gently pried it open, a wave of dust rose, accompanied by a musty scent that filled the air. Inside, there were 2 items, 2 tiny, identical silver lockets. I picked them up, the cool metal pressing against my fingers. They were beautifully crafted, each one engraved with a name, Theodore on one, Theodora on the other. The lockets were old, worn by time, but still elegant in their simplicity. I opened the first locket, and inside was a small, faded photograph of the twins as children. Their faces expressionless, their eyes cold and empty, much like in the last photograph I had seen. I opened the second locket. This time, instead of a photograph, there was something else. A tiny lock of hair perfectly preserved and bound with a thin piece of string. It was almost impossible to tell if it was dark or light, as the strands were so faint. But it had a peculiar feeling to it, as though it held a secret of its own. I closed the lockets carefully, the weight of what I had found settling heavily in my chest. My grandmother's actions, her decisions were beginning to make sense in a way I hadn't expected. The twins, the strange events, their eventual disappearance. It all led back to this hidden history buried in the attic, tucked away in forgotten corners. The connection between the journals, the photographs, and the lockets was undeniable. My grandmother had never truly let them go. They had been her children, her responsibility, and despite everything, she had kept them close. But the question that haunted me now was why? Why had she kept them locked away? Why the secrecy? Why not tell the truth about their lives, their fate? Had she been protecting us from something? Or was she simply unable to let go of her children, even in death? I sat there for a long time, the weight of the box in my lap, lost in thought. The answers I had sought were now within my grasp, yet they only led to more questions. What had really happened to the twins? Were they truly gone, or had something far darker taken place in that locked room in the silence of the house that had once been home? With a heavy heart, I carefully placed the box back inside the trunk, locking it again, as though trying to lock away the unsettling truth that now lingered in my mind. As I stood up and made my way back toward the attic stairs, I couldn't help but feel that the house had changed. The secrets it held were no longer hidden in the shadows. They had been brought into the light, and with them, a new chilling understanding of the past. The house that had once felt like home now seemed like a place that held nothing but the weight of forgotten memories, haunting and unrelenting. And as I descended back into the house, I realized that some doors once opened can never be closed again. The past was alive in the walls, in the rooms, in the very air I breathed. And it would never truly let me go. A small leather-bound book caught my eye, distinct from the journals. It looked older, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. When I opened it, I realized it wasn't a book at all, but a collection of carefully preserved newspaper clippings, each one encased between fragile, tissue-thin pages. The clippings spanned decades, all dating back to the early 1900s, each one documenting a similar and unsettling story. Twins born into my family followed by mysterious deaths. Strange illnesses or the twins themselves disappearing under suspicious circumstances. The same pattern repeated with every generation, always twins, always tragedy. The final clipping was from a local newspaper dated December 26, 1952. It was my grandfather's obituary. It mentioned his surviving wife and infant twins, but there was no mention of my mother, who would have been 5 years old at the time. I scanned the other journals in search of any mention of my mother and found a single entry from 1950. Margaret turns 3 today. She is such a joy, normal, healthy, everything a child should be. I thank God every day that she wasn't born a twin. Perhaps the curse has skipped a generation. A curse? What did my grandmother mean by that? If my mother was 5 when the twins were born, why had she never mentioned having siblings? I had to speak with my mother. I gathered the journals, the medical records, and the photographs, stuffing them all into a canvas bag that hung nearby. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something unusual in the far corner of the attic. A door small, barely 4 feet high, set into the sloped ceiling. It looked out of place among the trunks and old furniture. The wood was newer, the hinges less rusted, and the latch simple but sturdy. Common sense urged me to ignore it, to leave with what I had found, and get out of the attic. But curiosity overpowered my better judgment. I approached the door and lifted the latch. Beyond, the air was cold and the darkness felt thick with an unsettling presence. My flashlight illuminated a small room, its ceiling angled sharply, empty except for 2 child-sized rocking chairs facing each other in the center. They were painted white, their cushions faded pink, tied securely to the seats. As my light swept over the room, I noticed strange markings on the wall's floor and ceiling. They formed an intricate pattern, shifting as I moved the beam of light. I stepped closer, my unease growing, trying to make sense of the symbols. They weren't any language I recognized, and their very presence sent a shiver down my spine. It felt as though these symbols weren't meant for human mouths to pronounce. A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around, heart pounding in my chest. The door had swung shut, though there was no breeze in the attic to explain it. I rushed to grab the handle, but it refused to budge, as if held shut by an invisible force. Panic surged through me, and I threw my shoulder against the door. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, it gave way unexpectedly, sending me crashing to the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the main staircase, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I found my mother in the kitchen. sitting at the table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. She looked up when I entered, her eyes widening at the sight of the canvas bag clutched in my white-knuckled grip. "You've been in the attic," she said. It wasn't a question. I dumped the contents of the bag onto the table, the journals, the medical records, the photographs. "Tell me about the twins," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Tell me what happened to Theodore and Theodora." My mother's face drained of color as she stared at the items spread before her. For a moment I thought she might faint, but then she took a deep breath and gestured for me to sit. "I was 5 when they were born," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember being excited to have a brother and sister, but from the beginning there was something wrong with them. They didn't cry like normal babies. They just stared, watching everyone." My mother picked up one of the photographs, her finger tracing the outline of the twins' faces. "Father didn't believe me. He thought I was suffering from postpartum psychosis. He wanted to get me help, but I refused to leave them alone with anyone else. I was terrified of what they might do. And then he died," I said softly. She nodded. "They said it was an accident, that he tripped and fell down the stairs in the middle of the night. But I was awake. I heard them laughing afterward. Theodore and Theodora. They were only 6 months old." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened next?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Mother took them away after Christmas. She told everyone they had died of pneumonia, but she sent them to a private hospital in Europe. I didn't know where until years later, when I found some of her letters. By then they were really dead. Some experimental treatment went wrong, or so the hospital claimed. And the room on the 3rd floor, the nursery. I started, my heart pounding. Mother preserved it exactly as it was the day she took them away. She would go in there sometimes just to sit. She never let anyone else inside. I think she felt guilty. Despite everything, they were still her children." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "Do you believe they were evil?" "Actually evil." My mother was silent for a long moment, her fingers still tracing the photograph. "I believe there are things in this world we can't explain," she said finally. "Things beyond our understanding. The twins, they were something else. Something not quite human." The journals mentioned a curse, I pressed. "Twins in our family. What did it mean?" My mother sighed deeply. "It's an old family legend. Every few generations, twins are born to the women in our line, and those twins are never right. They bring death and destruction. The only way to end the cycle is to..." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "To kill them," I supplied, my voice hollow. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Mother couldn't do it. She couldn't kill her own children, no matter what they were. So she sent them away instead. But the guilt ate at her for the rest of her life." We sat in silence, the weight of this family's secret pressing down on us like a physical force. Finally, my mother reached across the table, taking my hand. "You need to leave this house, Eliza," she said urgently. "Sell it. Burn it down. I don't care. But don't stay here. The twins, their influence lingers. I've felt it all my life like a shadow at the edge of my vision. Promise me you won't stay." "I promise," I whispered, the weight of the curse settling into my bones. The revelation hit me like a wave, overwhelming and cold. The twins, Theodore and Theodora, along with every pair of twins in my family, weren't separate individuals. They were the same entity reincarnated through generations, wearing the same faces, the same expressions, their malevolent nature unchanged. The realization was so shocking, so utterly unsettling, I could hardly process it. Aunt Catherine, seeing my reaction, gave me a moment to absorb what she had said. "Theodore and Theodora," she said, "they were the same entity reincarnated through generations, wearing the same faces, the same expressions, their malevolent nature unchanged. The realization was so shocking, so utterly unsettling, I could hardly process it. Aunt Catherine, seeing my reaction, gave me a moment to absorb what she had said. They're not born in the usual way. She continued, her voice quiet but firm. Each generation, the entity chooses 2 children, the same faces, the same innocence, hiding the darkness inside. They take on the roles of twins, but they are always the same force, a force that can only be contained, never destroyed. It is bound by the ritual, but the binding is weakening. I felt the weight of her words sink into me, my mind racing to keep up. So all these deaths, the disappearances, the illnesses, it was because of them. Because of this entity. Yes, Aunt Catherine replied. Each time the twins come, the entity's influence spreads, bringing tragedy, destruction, and death. But the ritual, when done properly, can bind it, confine it to a space, delay it. The only thing that can stop it is an end to its earthly vessel, the twins themselves. But that requires more than just the ritual. The entity can't be destroyed by ordinary means. I couldn't breathe. The implications were suffocating. Then why didn't anyone ever end it? Why didn't my grandmother? She couldn't, Aunt Catherine interrupted gently. She tried. But there's a force of nature in those children, this entity, that even the strongest cannot resist. It calls to them, draws them in, as it draws in everyone connected to it. Your grandmother may have been the one to keep it bound for so long, but she had her own reasons for not destroying it. Guilt, love, the same reason your mother couldn't do it either. I thought back to the journals, the photographs, the strange room in the attic, the symbols on the walls. The air had felt wrong in that room, suffocating, as though the very house was aware of the dark history it held. And now I understood why. The house had been built to contain the entity, its influence spreading like a shadow over the lives of everyone who lived there. But the binding, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. The ritual, it's weakening. My grandmother's death, Aunt Catherine nodded gravely. The binding needs to be renewed, or else the entity will break free. Your grandmother held it together for decades, but now it's fragile. That's why you've been feeling it, hearing the whispers, noticing things moving. The house is starting to wake again. I sat back, the enormity of what Aunt Catherine was saying crashing over me. I had to act, but what could I possibly do? The grimoire warned of the dangers of performing the ritual without the proper knowledge and skill, but I had no choice. I had to try. You can help me. I said, the words coming out in a rush. You have to. You know how to renew the binding. You know what needs to be done. Aunt Catherine paused, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of sadness and caution. The ritual is not something you can take lightly, Eliza. It's dangerous, and it requires more than just knowledge. It requires sacrifice. You're asking to renew something that was never meant to be kept alive. Are you sure you're ready to do this? I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I couldn't let the entity be freed. Not after everything I had learned. Not after seeing the twisted history that had brought us to this point. I don't have a choice. I said, my voice firm. I need to stop it. Aunt Catherine stood in silence for a long moment before walking over to a large cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened it slowly, revealing an array of tools, herbs, and ancient texts. She then reached for a thick leather-bound book, its cover worn with age, and turned to a marked page. This is the ritual, she said, showing me the page. It's complicated, but it can be done. However, remember this, what you're about to do may not only bind the entity again, it could alter things in ways you cannot predict. The entity has been in your family for centuries, and it doesn't easily let go. I understand, I whispered, though deep down, I wasn't sure if I truly did. Together, we began to prepare. The next few hours were a blur of ritual preparation, gathering herbs, lighting candles, drawing symbols with salt and chalk and placing objects in precise locations around the room. As Aunt Catherine led me through each step, I could feel the weight of what we were attempting, the danger of it, but also the undeniable pull of necessity. When the time came, we stood before the binding room, where the air felt thick with anticipation. My heart pounded in my chest as Aunt Catherine began chanting in a language I didn't understand. The symbols we had drawn began to glow faintly, their power awakening, and I felt a coldness grip the house, like a breath held too long. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I prepared to say the final incantation. As I spoke the words, the air in the room seemed to shift, a whisper of something ancient and powerful echoing in the walls. And then the room went completely still. No more footsteps in the hall, no more whispers from the shadows. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was silent. But deep down, I knew this was only a temporary peace. The twins, the entity, the curse, whatever it was, would return. It always did. And I was no closer to ending it for good. But for now, the binding held, and for now, I had done what I could. Aunt Catherine turned to me, her eyes weary but resolute. "You've done what you can, Eliza. But remember, this is just the beginning." I nodded silently, knowing that for better or worse, the shadows of the past would always be with me. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if the very house itself was holding its breath. Each step I took seemed to make the floor creak louder, as if warning me to turn back. But there was no turning back now. I placed the last candle into position, my fingers trembling as the flickering light danced across the symbols on the floor. The glow from the chalky lines seemed to pulse almost alive, as though the ancient force they represented was awakening. Catherine's voice had risen into an almost guttural chant, her words unintelligible, yet somehow familiar. They seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house, sending a shiver up my spine. The room was now illuminated by the strange blue glow of the symbols and the flickering candlelight. But the light seemed insufficient somehow, just a faint barrier against the deep, suffocating darkness that threatened to overwhelm us. The air grew colder still, and I could feel something pulling at me, an invisible force like a tugging at the very core of my being. My heart began to race as I looked toward the cribs. They were silent now, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me, following every move I made. It was as though the twins, the entity, was already aware of what we were attempting. "Focus!" Catherine's voice cut through the tension, pulling me back to the task at hand. "We're almost there." I nodded, though a part of me wanted to glance back at the cribs to see if they were moving again. But I didn't dare. I had to trust that the ritual was working. The ancient energy in the room was palpable, alive, and it felt like every breath I took was pulling me deeper into the abyss. I could hear Catherine's voice rising the words, now more insistent, more powerful. As she chanted, the symbols on the floor began to shimmer with an eerie light, and the room seemed to grow even colder. The frost on the walls thickening, creeping toward the center of the room like some living thing. "Now," Catherine commanded. "The blood. We need the blood." I looked at her in horror, but she didn't wait for my hesitation. From her satchel, she pulled a small silver dagger, its blade gleaming in the dim light. My stomach turned as she cut her palm with swift precision, and the blood that spilled from her hand seemed to shimmer in the air, an unnatural glow around it. She reached toward the circle, and the blood dripped onto the wooden floor, soaking into the chalk markings. The room shuddered, the temperature plummeting to unbearable lows. The frost on the walls began to move, coiling and swirling in strange patterns, as though it were alive, feeding on the blood, growing stronger with each drop. And then the rocking chairs began to move again. The sound of creaking wood echoed in the silence, slow at first, then gaining speed. I could feel the presence growing stronger, like a storm gathering on the horizon, waiting to break. The room seemed to pulse with energy, each beat of the air thick with ancient power. I felt it in my bones, a force pressing against me, suffocating me. The twins, or what they had become, were awakening. "Finish it." Catherine's voice was strained now, panicked. "We need to bind it. We need to finish the incantation." My hands shook as I scrambled to pick up the final piece, the vial of powdered salt she had given me. I scattered it along the outer edge of the circle, crossing the chalk lines, binding the entity with the last protective measure. But as I did, I felt something shift, a terrible sensation of wrongness deep in my chest. The air was no longer just cold. It was pulling, tugging, as if something wanted to break through to escape. "Eliza now," Catherine's voice was louder, desperate. I forced myself to step into the center of the circle, my feet feeling heavy, as if the very floor was trying to hold me in place. The final words of the ritual were upon my lips. Words that felt foreign, and ancient words that had not been spoken in generations. I shouted them into the air, my voice barely rising above the wind that howled in the attic. As the last syllables left my mouth, a blast of cold air erupted from the center of the circle. The candles flickered violently, and the symbols on the floor glowed brighter than ever, before blinding in their intensity. I could hear a sound, a low, guttural growl from the direction of the cribs. It was as if something had been unleashed, something that was struggling, writhing within the confines of the circle. And then with a deafening crack, the force inside the room broke. The ground shook beneath me, and I felt the weight of centuries of anger, hatred, and sorrow slam against my chest. The presence was there in the room, and it was alive, ancient, powerful, and furious. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only felt the overwhelming presence of something older than time itself. The rocking chairs stopped moving abruptly. The air went still. The glowing symbols on the floor flickered and faded, leaving the room bathed in the eerie light of the lantern. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as though something had been sealed. Something had been contained once again. But it wasn't over. Catherine stood, her face pale and drawn blood still dripping from her hand. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the same fear reflected in them. "It's not gone," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's still here, Eliza, and it will come back." I could only nod, my own breath shaky and unsteady. The entity had been bound again for now, but it was never truly gone. There was always a price for meddling with such ancient forces, and we had paid it. But for the moment, the house was silent, and the evil that had haunted our family for centuries was at least contained. For how long, though? That remained to be seen. As I glanced at the nursery one last time, I felt a cold gust of wind and heard the faintest whisper, soft, almost a laugh. I turned quickly, my heart racing. But I saw nothing, no figures, no shadows. Just the chilling cold that swept through the mausoleum. The eerie silence was oppressive, almost suffocating, and it was becoming harder to breathe as the frost spread across the walls. The paper from the music box felt like it burned in my hands as I stared at the altar. The sensation of something being drawn into the stone, as if the mausoleum itself was pulling me closer, was unmistakable. The paper seemed to grow warmer in my hands, the ink on the page shifting, blurring, as though it were alive. I placed it against the smooth stone surface, and immediately there was a soft click, a shifting sound that came from the altar. A portion of the stone slid aside, revealing a small hidden compartment. My fingers trembled as I reached inside, pulling out a thin metal object. At first glance, it seemed like a pendant, a locket perhaps, but its shape was unfamiliar, almost wrong, like it belonged to another time, another world. I held the locket in my hand, feeling its weight and its coldness. It was intricately carved with the same symbols I had seen in the nursery and on the floor of the attic. The very same ones that had been used to bind the entity. It was as if this locket held the key to everything, the key to ending the curse once and for all. I could feel its power radiating in my palm, and the whispers in the air grew louder as though the twins, the entity, were aware of my discovery. "You cannot escape us." Their voices echoed sharp and unnerving. "We are tied to this bloodline. We are tied to this place." I had to act. I couldn't let them take what they had promised to collect another soul, another life from our family. I pressed the locket against the altar, hoping, praying that this was the final piece of the puzzle, the key my grandmother had left for me. The stone beneath my fingers warmed slightly as the locket pressed against it, and I felt a sudden surge of energy. The temperature in the mausoleum dropped even further, and I could hear the sound of the twins' laughter in the distance, growing fainter, like it was retreating. For a brief moment I thought it had worked. But then the sound of something large shifting behind me snapped my attention back to the door. The mausoleum shook with a violent tremor, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet buckling, as if the very earth was trying to split open. "No!" I shouted, clutching the locket with both hands, and in that moment I knew what I had to do. The grimoire had spoken of a price, a sacrifice for breaking the binding. Their power couldn't be undone without a cost. I could feel it now, an overwhelming pressure building inside my chest, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush me. I turned back to the altar, and with a steady hand, I placed the locket back into the depression in the stone. "To end what began, return them to where they first came," I whispered again, the words. Now familiar, the meaning clear. The energy in the room surged with violent intensity, and I could hear the twins' voices screaming in protest, their words distorted, panicked. The temperature dropped again, and I felt the walls of the mausoleum closing in on me. It wasn't enough just to contain them anymore. I had to send them back to sever the connection completely. I focused all of my thoughts on the locket, the symbols, and the sacrifice needed to undo the pact. I had to give up something to return them to their prison. A soul. My soul. I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of the power within me, the force of the entity's influence. It was unbearable, its grip tightening around my chest, but I didn't falter. This was the only way to end it. To finally end the curse that had haunted my family for generations, I made my choice. As I spoke the final incantation, the world around me blurred. The mausoleum seemed to twist, the walls stretching and bending as the shadows of the twins materialized before me, their forms flickering, fading in and out of existence. Their smiles were twisted, empty. "No," they cried out, their voices merging into one. "You cannot do this. You belong to us." The locket in the altar began to glow with a fierce, unearthly light. The stone cracked open wider, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness at its center. The shadows of the twins reached out toward me, their hands desperate, but I stood firm, forcing the words out despite the weight of the curse pressing down on me. With the last syllable, a blast of freezing cold struck me. I felt my body jerk, my vision swim, and I heard the entity scream in agony as the force of the ritual ripped it away from the mortal plane. I saw the twins' faces contort in anger and fear before they vanished into the swirling void. The coldness receded, and the darkness in the mausoleum finally cleared. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving with exhaustion. The locket, now glowing dimly in the center of the altar, had stopped pulsing. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted. The entity was gone, but I knew deep down that this would only be temporary. The curse was bound again, but not destroyed. It would return as it always did. And when it did, it would be up to the next generation to stop it once and for all. I took one last look at the mausoleum, the silent tombstone standing witness to the price paid to end the curse for now. Then, without another word, I left, stepping stepping back into the night, into the cold, knowing that the house would never truly be free from the shadows that had been cast upon it. But for now, the bloodline was safe, and the twins were contained once again, at least until the next time. As I placed the last candle, Catherine began the final phase of the ritual, drawing a small silver knife across her palm. Blood welled from the cut, dripping onto the grimoire she held open before her. "With blood of the line I bind thee," she intoned. "With words of power I contain thee. By salt and iron, by silver and ash, I command thee to remain within these bounds until the appointed time." The symbols on the floor flared brighter, their blue light shifting to a deep pulsing red. The rocking chairs began to move again, faster and faster, the wood creaking in protest at the unnatural motion. The temperature dropped, further ice crystals forming in the air around us. And then came the voices, childish yet ancient, speaking in unison from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You cannot bind us forever, daughter of Montgomery," they hissed. "We are eternal. We are patient. We will have what was promised to us." Catherine faltered, her face pale in the eerie light. I moved to her side, supporting her as she swayed on her feet. "Continue the ritual," I urged. "We have to finish it." She nodded, drawing a shaky breath. "Final words to seal the binding," she murmured, turning to the last page of the grimoire. Her eyes widened in shock. "It's gone. The final incantation, it's been erased." I looked over her shoulder and saw that she was right. Where there should have been text, there was only a blank space, as if the words had been lifted cleanly from the page. "How is that possible?" I whispered. The book was locked in my grandmother's desk. "They've been planning this," Catherine realized, horror dawning on her face. "All these years they've been waiting, influencing events from within their prison. They knew Elizabeth would die, knew the binding would weaken. They've prepared." The voices came again, louder now, accompanied by the sound of childish laughter that raised goosebumps on my skin. "Did you think we were helpless? Did you think we were contained? Foolish women playing with forces you cannot comprehend. The pact cannot be broken. The promise must be fulfilled." The symbols on the floor began to fade, the glowing light dimming as the binding weakened further. The rocking chairs stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard a new sound. Small footsteps approaching the door of the binding room. "We need the final words," I said desperately. "Catherine, think. My grandmother must have told you something, left some clue." Catherine closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Elizabeth knew this might happen. She would have prepared a contingency. Her eyes snapped open. The music box in the nursery, the one that plays that eerie lullaby. Elizabeth always kept it wound, always made sure it worked. I thought it was just sentimentality, but I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, ducking through the small door and racing across the attic. Behind me, I heard Catherine continuing the ritual, her voice raised in defiance against the childish taunts that filled the air. The nursery was different when I entered it. This time the air thick with malevolence, the shadows deeper and more substantial. The cribs seemed to loom larger, the toys arranged on the shelves, watching me with invisible eyes. On the dresser between the cribs sat a delicate porcelain music box painted with scenes of children playing in a garden. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to shatter or disappear before I could reach it. But it remained solid and real under my trembling fingers as I lifted the lid. A tinkling melody began to play, a lullaby I recognized from my own childhood. The notes slightly discordant, slightly wrong. Inside the box, nestled on a cushion of faded velvet, was a small piece of paper folded into a tight square. I unfolded it carefully, revealing a single sentence written in my grandmother's precise hand. To end what began, return them to where they first came. I stared at the words, trying to decipher their meaning. Return them. They were dead had been for decades. And where had they first come from? A child's voice spoke directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. She could never do it. She was too weak. But you're not weak, are you, Eliza? I whirled around, but the nursery was empty. The voice came again from the direction of the cribs. We've been waiting for you. We knew you would come back to this house eventually. Blood calls to blood. In the crib on the left, a small shape was forming, solidifying out of the shadows. The outline of a child, a boy of about 8, with dark hair and darker eyes. In the second crib, a similar shape appeared. A girl identical to the boy in every way, except for her longer hair. Theodore first whispered, "Theodora." They smiled in unison, the expression never reaching their eyes. We've had many names, they said together. Many faces, but always the same purpose. What purpose, I asked, though. I feared I already knew the answer. To collect what is owed, they replied. A soul from each generation, payment for the pact Abigail made. Prosperity and power in exchange for us. I backed away, clutching the paper from the music box. My grandmother bound you, I said. She found a way to contain you. Their laughter was like broken glass. Temporarily, but bindings weaken. People die, and we are very, very patient. From somewhere above, I heard Catherine cry out in pain. The ritual was failing. Whatever contingency my grandmother had planned, I needed to figure it out now. I looked down at the paper again. To end what began, return them to where they first came. Where had it all begun? The pact Abigail Montgomery had made in 1723. The cemetery, I realized aloud. The family mausoleum. Abigail is buried there. The twin smiles faltered, their forms flickering like candles in a breeze. You know nothing, they hissed, but I could hear the uncertainty in their voices. I turned and ran, the paper clutched in my hand, the twins' angry cries following me down the stairs. Outside, the night was unnaturally still. The moon hidden behind clouds that had appeared from nowhere. I ran across the overgrown lawn toward the small family cemetery. At the edge of the property, my heart hammering in my chest. The Montgomery Mausoleum stood at the center of the cemetery, a small neoclassical structure of weathered marble. The door was locked, but the key my grandmother had left me, the one that had opened the nursery, fit this lock as well. Inside, stone sarcophagi lined the walls, each engraved with names and dates spanning centuries. At the far end, set apart from the others, was a plain stone altar. I approached it cautiously, running my fingers over the smooth surface. There were no engravings, no decorations, nothing to indicate its purpose or significance. But as my hand passed over the center, I felt a slight depression, a space that seemed designed for something to fit inside. Behind me, the temperature dropped suddenly. Frost forming on the stone walls, the wind howled through the cemetery, and I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. Something was about to happen. Something final. And I knew that with this final act, whatever price there was to pay would be demanded of me. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.